Let's talk about impulse control disorders. Let's go through some definitions. A compulsion we talked about was something a person does to reduce distress. An impulse is something a person does to gain gratification. Stereotypical movements or tics have neither gratification nor reduction in distress, they just do it. Addictive disorders, you could see how gratifying an impulse could link into addictive disorders. And then comorbidities abound. People with OCD can have tics and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. People with impulse control disorders can also have addictive disorders. So DSM tries to put things in different chapters, but the line is not as clean as you would otherwise wish. So in DSM-4, there were 5 disorders: intermittent explosive disorder, kleptomania, pyromania, pathological gambling, and trichotillomania. But in DSM-5, they took the bottom 2 out, put pathological gambling over to addictive disorders, and put trichotillomania up with obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So you can see again, there's not a fine line between these. So under disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders is where you would find these disorders. So the main thing with intermittent explosive disorder is something happens to piss somebody off, and it can be minor or it can be big, but the natural thing to do is just to, talk to the other person or ignore them. Person with intermittent explosive disorder, it turns into the Incredible Hulk when they get mad. And they yell and they curse and they may fight and they may destroy property. And then shortly thereafter, they're exhausted and they feel very guilty. They knew they shouldn't have done so, but they did it. So that's basically the crux of intermittent explosive disorder, and it can't be accounted for by any other mental disorders. I mean, there's a lot of psychiatric disorders where a person can be irritable and destructive, but here you've got isolated intermittent explosive disorder whereby there's no irritability at baseline. It's just a surge of aggression or explosiveness that occurs after there is some kind of insult. So beforehand, there's a sense of tension, arousal. Then there's the explosive behavior. Initially, some relief. The person released his distress, but then they get the delayed consequence of guilt. The differential diagnosis is wide for people with impulse control disorder, and here I've given you a whole list. Much more common in men than in women, 3% annual prevalence, onset in the childhood to the early 20s. Kleptomania, you probably all heard of this, recurrent stealing of objects the person doesn't even need, and there's tension beforehand, and then pleasure after they've committed the theft and gotten away with it. It's not a vindictive type of stealing. It's not in response to another psychiatric disorder. Differential here is a shorter list. Antisocial personality disorder are criminals, and one may be just a criminal rather than a psychiatric disorder. In manic episodes, individuals are just spending a lot of money on things they don't need, but may also steal things as just a very risky behavior. And if a person has command hallucinations to steal stuff, that could be reflected in psychotic disorder. So this is the famous case of someone with kleptomania, and let's look at this little video. It's Winona Ryder.
Department stores are no stranger to crime. They're littered with CCTV setups to watch people like this lady here. As she loads her arms with goods and wanders round the store, the camera operator starts to notice there's one place she's not visiting: the till. She couldn't be more obvious if she had a sign on her back saying, "I'm a lifter." But maybe this is a destitute young woman, cold on a winter's eve, unable to pay for the clothes she so desperately needs to keep warm. Or maybe it's multi-millionaire and acclaimed actress Winona Ryder gathering up £6,000 worth of designer clobber and waltzing out the door. Yep, you've guessed it, it's a Hollywood star who doesn't need any of this stuff, and certainly doesn't need to steal it. Seriously though, what were her chances of getting away with it?
So you can see with kleptomania, there's a very similar pattern as with intermittent explosive disorder. And listed a couple of facts and figures that you can look at on your own. There are many other associated disorders. People with kleptomania often have compulsive shopping, depression, bulimia, personality disorders, and other impulse control disorders, and then addictive disorders. Pyromania is setting things on fire. There is tension beforehand, arousal, and then when the person actually sets fire, they're gratified. It's not done for secondary gain, meaning it's not to get insurance money or to take revenge against somebody specifically, and it's not better accounted for by another psychiatric disorder. There's a lot of planning and advanced preparation for this, and basically see similar to the gratification. The reaction to consequences is indifferent or satisfaction. This is kind of different. With the other impulse control disorders, there's a regret and guilt, and here there isn't any. The profile is a Caucasian boy from a large family, low socioeconomic status, history of delinquent behavior, drinks alcohol or abuses substances, and often they can be treated with behavioral therapy. But if at any time during the course of the illness they made a suicide attempt, it predicts that they're going to relapse, start doing it all over again. Again, I've listed here differential diagnosis. So the treatment of impulse control disorders, cognitive behavioral therapy, by identifying and avoiding triggers, countering the maladaptive thoughts, behavioral interventions, teaching coping strategies to resist the urges, and drugs. SSRIs have some evidence of efficacy against intermittent explosive disorder. The other ones are desperate efforts to try to see if they'll work. Makes sense now, naltrexone might help because by blocking mu-opioid receptors, they block the pleasurable effects of opioids. That may be the pathway by which some of these behaviors provide gratification. Topiramate is a glutamate antagonist that's used off-label for alcohol dependence and is quite effective. It also works well for binge eating disorder or for bulimia. So it also has some evidence of efficacy for impulsive types of disorders, and so we try that as well.